not for silk, not for spices, but to deliver 3 Buddhist nuns to China, because without them, a ceremony that would shape over 1,000 years of religious history simply could not happen. That lineage, unbroken from that moment, now Chinese nuns' spiritual doubt set the whole thing in motion. One of the most consequential acts of religious transmission in history happened, why it almost didn't, and what it looks like when a 1,600-year-old lineage takes root in a new land. I've got someone here who has gone deep into the primary sources on this, so let's get into it. Walk me through what we're actually talking about when we say Bhikkhunī lineage.
So a Bhikkhunī, spelled B-H-I-K-K-H-U-N-I, is a fully ordained Buddhist nun. And I want to emphasize that word fully, because it matters enormously to this story. In the Buddhist monastic system, there are different levels of commitment. You have lay people, you have novices, and then you have fully ordained monastics, bhikkhus for men, bhikkhunis for women. Full ordination means living under the complete monastic code, the Vinaya, which is this extraordinarily detailed set of rules governing everything from how you eat to how you conduct ceremonies.
And the Vinaya is where the whole drama of this story begins, right?
Exactly. The Vinaya has a very specific requirement for ordaining nuns. It's called dual ordination, or in Chinese, busong shou jie. What that means is that a candidate for full ordination as a nun must first be ordained by a chapter of at least 10 fully ordained nuns, and then by a chapter of at least 10 fully ordained monks. Both assemblies, both sides. And here's the problem that set everything in motion. By the early 5th century in China, there were no fully ordained nuns. None. Women who wanted to pursue monastic life could only be ordained by monks alone.
So they were stuck in this loop. You need ordained nuns to ordain nuns, but there are no ordained nuns.
That's precisely it. And this wasn't a new problem. Women like Zhu Jingjian and Huiguo had been living as de facto nuns since the 4th century, taking novice precepts, living in communities, practicing seriously. But according to the Bhikkhunī Lineage, that's the Biographies of Eminent Nuns, compiled by the monk Bao Chang between 516 and 519 CE, these women had only received ordination from monks, which was expedient but controversial. The question of whether that ordination was truly valid under the Vinaya was a live and uncomfortable debate.
And that's where Sengguo of Guangling enters the picture.
She does, and she is a fascinating figure. According to the Bhikkhunī Lineage, Sengguo was born in 408 CE in Guangling, that's modern Yangzhou in Jiangsu province, a region known for Buddhist activity and proximity to major trade routes. Her biography describes her as exceptionally devout, deeply ascetic, and a serious meditator. There are accounts of her entering states of meditation so deep that her body appeared lifeless. Now, that's hagiographical language. It's the kind of miraculous detail that legitimizes a figure's spiritual authority in these texts. But what's historically significant is what she did with that authority.
Which was to ask the uncomfortable question.
Right. She was not satisfied with the status quo. She kept asking, is our ordination actually valid? Are we truly bhikkhunis under the Vinaya, or are we something less? And that doubt, that refusal to accept a lesser standard, is literally the engine that drives the entire transmission event we're about to describe.
So what actually happens? How does the lineage get to China?
It comes by sea. In 429 CE, a Sri Lankan shipmaster named Nandi, and I want to pause on that for a second, because Nandi was a merchant, not a monk, arrived in Jiangkang, which is modern Nanjing, the capital of the Liu Song dynasty. He brought with him a group of Buddhist nuns from Sri Lanka. Originally, 10 nuns set out, but 2 died during the voyage, so 8 arrived. They were received at Jingfu Nunnery, a prominent institution in the capital.
Wait, a merchant made this voyage specifically to bring nuns?
He did. And that tells you something remarkable about how commerce and faith were completely entangled in the ancient world. According to the sources, including the analysis in the maritime transmission of the monastic order of nuns to China, the sea route from Sri Lanka to China was perilous but well established by the early 5th century. Sri Lanka was a key node in Buddhist and commercial networks across the Indian Ocean. Merchants like Nandi were not just moving goods, they were moving religious specialists, texts, and ritual expertise.
So the Sri Lankan nuns arrive. What happens when they meet Sengguo?
The Bhikkhunī Lineage records a really striking exchange. The Sri Lankan nuns asked Sengguo whether any foreign nuns had previously come to China and whether the local nuns had received dual ordination. Sengguo told them the truth. No foreign nuns had come before, and the Chinese nuns had only received ordination from monks, not from a dual assembly. That conversation crystallized the problem. Here were fully ordained foreign nuns, and here was a Chinese nun who had been living under a system that, by strict Vinaya standards, was incomplete.
And Sengguo didn't just accept that. She went looking for answers.
She consulted Gunavarman, spelled Gunavarman, a renowned Kashmiri monk and Vinaya specialist who had actually arrived in China on Nandi's ship. He was known for translating key Vinaya texts, including the Karmavachana text for nuns of the Dharmaguptaka school. Sengguo presented her case to him, invoking the precedent of Mahaprajapati, the Buddha's aunt and the very first Bhikkhunī, who had received ordination through an expedient means when no dual assembly existed.
What did Gunavarman say?
His position was nuanced and really quite pragmatic. He affirmed that, given the absence of both assemblies in China, the ordination by monks alone was valid as an expedient measure, so he wasn't invalidating what the Chinese nuns had already done. But he also said that a second ordination in the presence of a full chapter of nuns would augment the prestige and legal standing of the Chinese Bhikkhunī Saṅgha. It would strengthen the lineage without negating the first ordination. That's a very careful legal and doctrinal position.
So the path forward was clear. Get enough nuns together for a proper dual ordination. But there was a problem.
Two problems, actually. First, the Vinaya requires at least 10 fully ordained nuns for a valid ordination. With only 8 Sri Lankan nuns surviving the voyage, they were too short. Second, and this is the detail I find almost unbelievably human, the Sri Lankan nuns didn't speak Chinese, and the ordination ritual requires clear communication, the transmission of precepts, full understanding. You can't just gesture your way through it.
So what do they do?
Nandi goes back to Sri Lanka. He makes a second voyage to recruit more nuns. And while he's gone, this is a 4-year interval. From 429 to 433 CE, the first group of Sri Lankan nuns stays in Jiangkang, living at Jingfu Nunnery, integrating into the local community and learning Chinese. 4 years of language study in a foreign country, far from home, waiting for the ceremony they came to enable.
That level of commitment is hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. And then in 433 CE, Nandi returns with a second group of 3 Sri Lankan nuns, headed by Devasāra. Her Chinese name in the sources is Tiesaluo. 3 new nuns joining the 8 survivors from the first voyage brings the total to 11. That meets the Vinaya requirement. The quorum is complete, and crucially, the earlier arrivals now speak Chinese. Every obstacle has been cleared.
And Gunavarman, the Vinaya master who had given the legal guidance, was he there for the ceremony?
He wasn't. Gunavarman had died in 432 CE, just 1 year before the ceremony. So the responsibility for presiding over the ordination fell to Saṅghavarman in Sanskrit, an Indian monk renowned for his expertise in Vinaya and translation work. According to the Encyclopedia of Buddhism, his presence ensured the ceremony would be conducted in strict accordance with the Vinaya, lending further legitimacy to the proceedings.
So walk me through what actually happened at Nanlin Temple.
Nanlin Temple was a major monastic center in Jiangkang. The dual ordination ceremony was held there, meticulously prepared, with participants strictly following the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya rules. The procedure required that candidates first receive ordination from the chapter of nuns, now including the Sri Lankan contingent, and then from the chapter of monks. Both assemblies, in sequence, as the Vinaya prescribes. And the scale of what happened is staggering. Over the course of 11 days, more than 300 Chinese women received full dual ordination, including Sengguo herself.
300 women in 11 days.
More than 300. The sources, including the Revival of Buddha's Saṅgha Association's documentation of this history, record prominent figures like Huiguo and Jingyin among those ordained. The scale tells you something important. There was enormous pent-up demand. These were women who had been living as de facto nuns, practicing seriously, waiting for the institutional recognition that the Vinaya required. When the door finally opened, hundreds walked through it.
And this is the moment the lineage begins, the unbroken chain that reaches all the way to today.
This is the foundational event. The 433 CE dual ordination at Nanlin Temple is widely recognized as the establishment of the continuous Bhikkhunī lineage in China. And the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya tradition that was used, that became the dominant tradition for ordination in China, particularly for nuns. From that ceremony, the lineage spread to Korea, to Vietnam, and in modern times, it became the basis for the revival of full ordination in Sri Lanka and other Theravada countries, where the lineage had lapsed around the 11th century.
Wait, the lineage lapsed in Sri Lanka, the country that sent the nuns to China in the first place?
Yes, and that's one of the great ironies of this history. According to the e-Buddhism analysis of Bhikkhunī ordination, the Theravada Bhikkhunī lineage lapsed around the 11th century in Sri Lanka, amid invasions and upheavals that ended the great monastery culture of Anuradhapura. The monk's lineage, when it faltered, could be restored by inviting monks from Burma or Siam. But the nuns' order couldn't be, because no Theravada country had kept it alive. For the better part of 1,000 years, a Theravada woman simply could not become a fully ordained nun.
So the lineage that Sri Lanka sent to China in 433 CE, it survived in China while it died out in Sri Lanka.
Exactly. And the modern revival, when it came, was an act of cross-tradition cooperation that mirrors the original transmission. The one place a continuous full ordination lineage for women had survived was the East Asian Mahayana tradition, the Dharmaguptaka lineage, preserved in China, Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam. The argument that unlocked the revival was that this surviving lineage, the one that traces directly back to Devasāra and the 433 CE ceremony, could be used to restore what Theravada had lost.
So the lineage went from Sri Lanka to China, survived in China for over 1,000 years, and then came back to restore what Sri Lanka had lost. That's a remarkable full circle.
It really is.
There's something almost poetic about that. The lineage crossed the Indian Ocean in 433 CE on a wooden ship. Now it's crossed the Pacific and the Atlantic and landed in Ontario.
And the mechanism is the same. Committed individuals, cross-cultural cooperation, and the willingness to do the hard practical work. The Sri Lankan nuns learned Chinese. The modern Bhikkhunīs built a monastery in a Canadian forest. The form changes, but the structure of transmission is remarkably consistent.
I want to make sure we've given Devasāra herself her due, because she's the name in our title, and we've talked about her arrival, but not really about who she was.
The sources identify Devasāra, her Chinese name is Tiesaluo, as the leader of the second group of Sri Lankan nuns who arrived in 433 CE. She is described as a key participant in the dual ordination ceremony at Nanlin Temple. Her arrival was the piece that completed the quorum. Without her and the two nuns who came with her, the ceremony could not have been held. The Bhikkhunī Juan and the later sources that corroborate it, including Dao Xuan's Sifenlu, Shanfan, Buke, Xingxichao, all recognize her role as foundational.
She crossed an ocean to complete a ceremony that had been waiting 4 years for her.
And she did it knowing that the earlier nuns had spent 4 years preparing, learning the language, integrating into the community, waiting. There's a kind of relay race quality to the whole transmission. Nandi runs the first leg, the 8 nuns run the second, Devasāra runs the third, Saṅghavarman runs the fourth, and then more than 300 Chinese women carry it forward from there.
And Sengguo is the one who started the race by asking whether the race was worth running at all.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Her doubt was the starting gun. And the Bhikkhunī Juan preserves that doubt not as a weakness, but as a virtue, as the kind of rigorous, honest inquiry that leads to genuine institutional reform. The text is making an argument. This is what it looks like when someone takes the Vinaya seriously enough to demand that it be followed properly.
So when you step back from all of this, the 429 CE arrival, the 4 years of language learning, the 433 CE ceremony, the spread to Korea and Vietnam, the modern revival, the monastery in Ontario, what does this story really come down to?
It comes down to the fact that institutions are made by people who refuse to accept good enough. Sengguo had a valid ordination by the standards of her time. She could have lived her whole life as a respected nun and no one would have questioned it. But she kept asking, is this actually right? Is this actually what the Vinaya requires? And that question, asked persistently and honestly, set in motion a chain of events that involved a Sri Lankan merchant, 8 nuns on a dangerous ocean voyage, 4 years of language study, a second voyage, a ceremony over 11 days, and a lineage that is now 1,600 years old.
And the lineage itself is the answer to her question.
Exactly. The 433 CE dual ordination at Nanlin Temple was the answer to Sengguo's doubt. And every Bhikkhunī ordained since then, in China, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Sri Lanka, in Canada, is a continuation of that answer. The lineage is the proof that the question was worth asking.
There's also something worth naming about what this story reveals about how Buddhism actually spread. It wasn't just monks carrying texts overland on the Silk Road. It was nuns on ships. It was merchants making second voyages. It was women learning foreign languages in foreign countries.
The scholarship on maritime transmission really emphasizes this. The SeaLionHistory.com analysis describes Sri Lanka as a crossroads of Indian Ocean networks, and the SlideServe presentation on maritime transmission of the monastic order of nuns to China documents how these sea routes enabled the movement of religious specialists at a time when overland routes were less accessible or politically unstable. The story of Devasāra and the Sri Lankan nuns is a story about the Indian Ocean as a highway for religious transmission.
And now that highway has extended to the Ottawa Valley.
It has. The lineage is not just surviving in Canada, it's actively growing and connecting.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about the Bhikkhunī Juan, the biographies of eminent nuns, because Sengguo's story is preserved there, and I think it's worth sitting with what that text actually is and why it matters.
Baochang compiled the Bhikkhunī Juan between 516 and 519 CE, so about 80 years after the events we're describing. It's the earliest extant collection of Chinese Buddhist nuns' biographies, documenting the spiritual lives, struggles, and achievements of 65 nuns, with an additional 30 mentioned in appendices. Modern scholars like Anne Hireman and Catherine Ann Tsai have provided critical translations and analyses of this text, situating Sengguo's biography within broader debates about hagiography, religious authority, and institutional change.
And hagiography is a word worth unpacking here, because it's not just biography.
Right. Hagiography is the writing of saints' lives. It blends historical detail with miraculous or exemplary elements designed to inspire and legitimize. So when the Bhikkhunī Juan describes Sengguo entering meditation so deep her body appeared lifeless, that's hagiographical language. It's not necessarily literal, but what it does is establish her spiritual authority, which is the text's way of saying, this person's doubts and actions deserve to be taken seriously. Her questioning of the ordination system wasn't just personal anxiety, it was the action of someone with genuine spiritual standing.
And that's what makes her story so compelling to me. She wasn't a powerful figure in any conventional sense. She was a nun in a system that didn't fully recognize her, and her doubt changed everything.
That's exactly the right way to frame it. The Bhikkhunī Juan frames her role as both courageous and prudent. She didn't just rebel, she sought authoritative guidance. She worked within the system while pushing it to be better. And the result was a ceremony that ordained more than 300 women and established a lineage that has now lasted over 1,600 years.
Let's talk about the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya for a second, because that's the specific tradition that was used at Nanlin Temple, and it's the one that became dominant in China. What is it, and why does it matter?
By the early 5th century, 4 major Vinaya schools had been translated into Chinese: Mahisasaka, Mahasamgika, Dharmaguptaka, and Sarvastivada. The Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, promoted by figures like Dao Xuan, became the dominant tradition for ordination in China, particularly for nuns. It prescribes the dual Saṅgha procedure in detail, the examination of candidates, the instruction in precepts, the acceptance by both assemblies. The 433 CE ceremony at Nanlin Temple followed this model, which is why the lineage it established is specifically a Dharmaguptaka lineage.
And that lineage is what spread to Korea and Vietnam.
Yes. The sources, including the revival of Buddha's Saṅgha Association's documentation, note that the successful transmission of the Vinaya precepts in 433 CE had far-reaching consequences not only for the status of women in Chinese Buddhism, but also for the spread of the Bhikkhunī order to Korea and Vietnam. And in modern times, it became the basis for the revival of ordination in Sri Lanka and other Theravada countries. One ceremony, 11 days, more than 300 women, and the ripples are still spreading.
I keep coming back to Nandi, the merchant, because he's this almost invisible figure in the story. He's not a monk, he's not a nun, he doesn't get a biography in the Bhikkhunī Juan, but without him, none of this happens.
He's crucial, and the scholarship on maritime transmission really highlights this. The SeaLionHistory.com analysis of ancient Sri Lankan seaports and maritime trade describes Sri Lanka as a crossroads of Indian Ocean networks in this period. Merchants like Nandi were not just moving goods, they were the infrastructure of Buddhist transmission. He made 2 dangerous ocean voyages specifically to transport nuns and Vinaya masters. The first time he brought 8 nuns and Saṅghavarman. The second time, 4 years later, he brought Devasāra and 2 others. That's an extraordinary personal commitment to a religious project.
And the language barrier, I want to come back to that too, because I think it's easy to gloss over how significant it was.
It's one of the most striking practical details in the whole story. The ordination ritual requires clear communication, the transmission of precepts, the examination of candidates, the formal declarations. You cannot perform it through an interpreter in the middle of the ceremony. So the Sri Lankan nuns who arrived in 429 CE spent 4 years learning Chinese. 4 years. In a foreign country, far from home, in a language that is about as different from Sinhala as a language can be. And they did it so that when Devasāra arrived in 433 CE and the quorum was complete, they could participate fully.
That's a level of dedication that's hard to even conceptualize.
It is. And it reflects what the scholarship describes as the cosmopolitan and syncretic character of early medieval Chinese Buddhism. The Liusong court under Emperor Wen was a cosmopolitan hub. Jiankang attracted scholars, monks, and merchants from across Asia. The presence of Sri Lankan nuns learning Chinese in a Jiankang nunnery was remarkable, but it was also, in a sense, exactly what that world made possible.
Let me ask you something that I think listeners might be wondering. There's a debate in modern Buddhism about whether the Bhikkhunī lineage that was revived in the 20th century is legitimate, whether the Dharmaguptaka lineage can be used to restore a Theravada lineage. How does the 433 CE story speak to that debate?
That's a live and genuinely contested question. The e-Buddhism source on Bhikkhunī ordination describes it as one of the most consequential threads in modern Buddhism. The argument for legitimacy draws directly on the 433 CE precedent. The Chinese Bhikkhunī lineage was established using the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, which is a different school from the Theravada Vinaya, but the ordination was accepted as valid. The argument is that cross-tradition cooperation has historical precedent. It's not a modern innovation. It's what actually happened in 433 CE.
So the critics of the modern revival are essentially arguing against something that already happened 1,600 years ago.
That's one way to frame it. The counter-argument is that the Vinaya traditions are distinct enough that a Dharmagupta ordination cannot restore a Theravada lineage. It's a genuinely complex doctrinal question. But what the 433 CE story shows is that the people involved, Sengguo, Gunavarman, Saṅghavarman, the Sri Lankan nuns, were not rigid about tradition when the goal was to establish something legitimate and enduring. They were pragmatic, careful, and collaborative.
And the result of that pragmatism is a lineage that is now in Canada.
The 433 CE story is not ancient history sitting in a museum. It's a living tradition that people are actively studying, practicing, and transmitting.
Here's what I keep thinking about, and I think it applies well beyond Buddhism.
It does. The Bhikkhunī Juan, the text that preserves Sengguo's biography, was compiled by Baochang between 516 and 519 CE, about 80 years after the events. He was making an argument. These women's lives matter. Their institutional contributions matter. Their spiritual achievements matter. That argument is still being made today by scholars like Anne Hireman and Catherine Ann Tsai. The lineage that Devasāra carried across the Indian Ocean in 433 CE is being transmitted in a Canadian forest in 2026.
So here's what this really comes down to for anyone listening. You now know a story that almost nobody outside Buddhist studies knows, and it's one of the most consequential stories in the history of religion. A Chinese nun's doubt, a Sri Lankan merchant's 2 voyages, a group of nuns learning a foreign language for 4 years, a ceremony over 11 days, and a lineage that has now lasted over 1,600 years and reached Canada.
And the actionable insight, if there is one, is this. The next time you encounter an institution that seems fixed and permanent, remember that it was made by specific people making specific decisions at specific moments. The Bhikkhunī lineage in China was not inevitable. It happened because Sengguo refused to accept good enough, because Nandi got back on a ship, because 8 nuns spent 4 years learning Chinese. Institutions are made by people, and people can remake them.
We're ending it with a monastery in a Canadian forest, and the thread connecting them is 1,600 years of women asking the same question Sengguo asked. Is this actually right? Is this actually what we're supposed to be doing? And then doing the hard work to make it so. That's the story of Devasārā Therī's journey. Thanks for being here.